to the positional power that they occupy. So some people, for instance, have very disproportionate levels of power based largely upon them, upon who they are and the type of personal persuasion and characteristics that they have. These sorts of things are actually extremely important within these settings, because if you imagine that some kind of consensus might form, I mean, consciously or otherwise, over a period of time, if that consensus is being shaped by things that are beyond our predictive capacities, we need to understand where that is coming from and why it's coming in that way. And I suppose this is one of the things that we flag in the book, is that we need to look beyond this idea of resource dependency and rather crude conceptions of power, because what's actually taking place in these settings is extremely soft, highly idiosyncratic, and quite unpredictable at times. It's not simply a case that we can look at the powers negotiating around the table and decide what the outcome is going to be. The processes are extremely soft and personal.
Could you give us the kind of example you alluded to in the book, just for the listeners, in terms of the idiosyncratic functions there, in terms of relating to soft power? Just to give a concrete example, if you could.
About the idiosyncrasies of power. Well, I mean, one person's name who came up time and time again was Conrad Black. And Conrad Black, he was a powerful individual, and as you know, the Hollinger Group was a powerful media business, but by no means the largest and most powerful of its kind. And one of the interesting things about Conrad Black, of course, is he was a rather bombastic, and still is, rather bombastic figure. Love him or hate him, there was no ignoring him. And it's quite clear, certainly throughout the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, that he very often held court in these sorts of environments. Now, of course, he's a very conservative figure. He's mellowed a little bit, perhaps, in some social areas, but his power within this setting was not necessarily, although you could argue it was partly a function of his positional power and his media ownership, but his power in these settings was largely a function of who he was. I mean, can you imagine, as I said, whether you like him or not, can you imagine trying to argue in public with this man? I mean, he's a pretty formidable character and a very persuasive individual, and actually very, if what I've heard is correct, very humorous and compelling. So you can see the seductive allure, and this type of stuff happens time and time again. It's like any network. There are rules of the game. There are things you have to learn, but there are also more informal kind of nods and winks, and this is a boys' club essentially. And if those things start to come into the frame, you start to think, well, what is the nature of the consensuses that are being formed? Is it just sort of is this a natural byproduct of powerful interactions, or is this something else? And I think it's something else. Like, certainly Andrew Nader and myself have, as I said, talked about this at length, and we don't want to overstate the significance of personal interactions. But neither should we ignore them, and that is actually the reality of much international relations literature. It's focused very much on the clubs, the interactions, the formal and informal state powers and so forth, but very little on the nature of individual power and personal power.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you're highlighting almost the social psychology that operates in these situations where individual has personal qualities that may render other people more submissive in situations. So as you say, it's a boys' club, so I can appreciate individuals feeling intimidated. So by your standard of reasoning, which I'm willing to believe to a certain extent will go a long way, you could have someone like Bill Gates. I don't know the man personally or anything about his characteristics, but he owns obviously a very large and powerful company, yet in a social situation against Conrad Black, he may basically, as you say, he's not going to want to argue in public with the man. I don't know, he could be the most confident man in the world, but I'm just assuming here just for the example of making this point. But if that is the case, then I'm just really interested in this consensus topic, because if that is the case and Conrad Black doesn't wield as much power in today's world as, say, someone like Mark Zuckerberg does, and obviously not like President Obama. So have you got any ideas in terms of what happens when they leave this Bilderberg meeting? Because if someone personally doesn't get on with Conrad Black, and he could argue with them in public and could even perhaps beat them in a debate in public, and obviously it's going to cause kind of social embarrassment or discomfort for others. But is there any ideas of what would happen if this does happen with a dominant figure like Conrad Black or whoever in this setting, and then the people that hold the, for lack of a better word, the real political and economic power, what's to stop them from going away and going, I don't want to discuss what Conrad Black was suggesting, I don't want to implement it, or B, I don't want him back next year? Have you got any ideas how those two overlap?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to say. I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not an apologist for the group. Let's be clear about that. But I think that it's naive. It's naive and just factually wrong to suggest that decisions are made by the Bilderberg group. Okay, that is just not the way that it works. Now there may be sub networks within this group that, and even if you could point to policies that sort of came about as a consequence of this activity, you'd still have a problem unpicking the precise nature of the contribution of Bilderberg within the whole. I mean, for instance, we know that Bilderberg was highly instrumental, for instance, in the formation of the European community in the 1950s. We know that much of the thinking and the impetus and the motivation came out of networks of this kind. We know also, thanks to historical work in this area, that there was that the politicians of the era were extremely enamored and aware of the significance and, shall we say, influence and power of these organizations. So, for instance, Hugh Wilford's work, the prominent historian, has looked at the Gateskill papers. And we know that Hugh Gateskill makes reference to this organization of Bilderberg and specifically asks people not to mention the group, but that they should be involved. So the kind of revisionists within the Labour Party were enormously enamored with the Bilderberg group. We also know that Harold Wilson in 1964-65 was sufficiently persuaded of the significance and importance of this network to consider the formation of a Commonwealth Bilderberg group. Not going to be called Bilderberg, but a Commonwealth version of the same, to challenge this Atlantic, not to challenge it, but to complement it and possibly protect British interests, of course. So we know, I mean, if a Labour Party Prime Minister can be sufficiently persuaded of the need to create a Commonwealth version of this with Prince Philip at its helm, we know, and to suffer the potential consequences of that if his constituents hear about it, we know that there must be some significant power at play. So there's, that's not, as I say, I'm not an apologist for that. But at the same time, I recognize, from our interviews with members of the group, that they do not sit around as a group and debate an issue and make a decision. It's just not done that way. It's just that perhaps something is discussed. Maybe on balance, it was felt that somebody or some argument won the day. Maybe that has a bearing on how people think about it. They go into the coffee breaks. They go into they have dinner in the evening around tables, and they laugh, they joke, and they discuss the issues. And with a nod and a wink, they all kind of know who they like and who they don't like, and what they found interesting, what they didn't. So the consensus, if a consensus forms, and by the way, I mean, we're talking about lots of different issues here. Consensus is formed to varying degrees. Sometimes there's you may have unanimity on a particular issue, but in other areas you may have great fragmentation. But what the group does do is it sort of discreetly codifies the legitimate. So within these elite circles over a period of time, newcomers